My name is Eliza Vance. For 5 decades, I have moved through the sanctified, rarefied air of the global art market, the silent, elegant custodian of history, the meticulous architect of narratives. I have curated the legacies of kings, championed the forgotten genius of painters, and dictated the cultural value of centuries of human expression with an authority few dared to challenge. The world knows me as the unflappable oracle, a woman whose impeccable taste and absolute chilling self-control are legendary. This public persona is the perfectly burnished armor I forged from the most profound wound of my youth. The art world sees success, dedication, and peerless judgment. I see preparation. Every day of my professional life, every exhibition, every discreet acquisition, has been a calculated step toward this singular final moment. I have been weaving the rope of retribution, meticulously strengthening the noose with scholarly integrity, ready to hang a ghost's reputation in the full light of public scrutiny. My final exhibit, set to open in exactly 3 months at the venerable Metropolitan Museum, is universally anticipated as the triumphant zenith of my career. It is a comprehensive retrospective of the celebrated American modernist painter, Arthur Hollis, a man whose canonical status I ironically helped solidify early in my ascent. Critics are already calling it my magnum opus, the definitive, unassailable statement on his life's work, a testament to my scholarly dedication and intellectual endurance. They praise my profound understanding of his oeuvre, never suspecting that my understanding stems from a deep, intimate knowledge of his core lie. They have no idea how profoundly right they are in calling it my masterpiece, but for all the completely wrong reasons. This exhibit is not a celebration of Hollis. It is the calculated and devastating dismantling of everything he fraudulently represented. I feel the final countdown ticking within the silent halls of the museum, and the anticipation of justice is exquisite. The opening night guest list is not merely a social register. It is a precise document of the power structure I intend to expose. It includes museum trustees, billionaires, influential international critics, and, crucially, the entire surviving Hollis family, the inheritors of his stolen prestige and ill-gotten fortune. They will all gather in the Grand Hall, accepting compliments, ready to toast my genius and celebrate their patriarch's towering prestige, their inherited wealth feeling comfortably secure. They will be utterly oblivious to the fact that they are walking into a trap 50 years in the making, designed with the patience of geological time and the precision of a master assassin. The finest champagne will flow, the spotlights will shine with dramatic intensity, and the quiet, institutional destruction of a legacy will commence, all engineered by the seemingly frail, elegant woman they dismissively regard as merely the devoted curator. To the unsuspecting world, my professional connection to Arthur Hollis was always presented as purely synergistic and professional, a perfect collaboration between an influential artist and his most dedicated scholar. But our true history began long before I was a curator, back when I was just 18 years old, brimming with reckless, desperate talent, and tragically, dangerously naive about the corrupting nature of power. I was a brilliant but penniless student desperate for validation and guidance in a world that only favored the connected. Hollis saw that burning hunger in me and ruthlessly exploited it with the cold efficiency of a predator. He recognized my budding genius, not with the intent to nurture it, but with the cynical desire to consume it, ensuring his own longevity by feeding on the fresh ideas of the young. Our history is not one of respectful collaboration. It is one of profound, violating theft and silent conquest. The year was a turbulent 1974. I was a final-year student at the prestigious Harrington Academy of Art, painting canvases with a raw, almost desperate energy that belied my youth. I wasn't just considered good. My professors, in their rare moments of genuine honesty, admitted I was an innovative force, already revolutionary in my technique and perspective. My final thesis project, a sprawling, monumental, emotionally raw depiction of industrial decay and urban blight, was universally slated to win the Academy's highest career-making award. This single piece was my guaranteed ticket out of poverty, my validation, and my passport to a sustainable future, resting precariously on a 6 by 10-foot canvas I had poured my entire soul, vision, and existence into. The sheer potential power that painting held was immense and terrifying. Arthur Hollis, already in his late 40s, was an established, towering figure in the city's art scene, handsome, intensely magnetic, and the de facto ruler of the Academy's small, often incestuous universe of patronage. He was 30 years my senior, and initially presented himself as my trusted mentor, a relationship I cherished and tragically misinterpreted, confusing his professional guidance with genuine, ethical respect. He praised my thesis piece lavishly, declaring that my canvas, which I titled The Scar of Progress, captured a raw, unsentimental truth his own celebrated work had somehow missed, making me feel uniquely seen and validated. He invited me to his studio late one night, supposedly for an essential, private critique of the final touches, pouring me expensive wine, while the city lights glittered far below his opulent loft window. The stage was thus carefully and cynically set for my immediate ruin. The meeting was, of course, not a critique. It was a cold, calculated proposition designed to assert dominance. He suggested a collaboration far beyond the professional, believing my desperate ambition would override my principles and personal dignity. When I refused his advances, shaken, humiliated, but fundamentally resolute in protecting myself and my work, I had committed the unforgivable, mortal sin. A young woman had denied a powerful man his assumed entitlement. I left his studio in the early morning hours, believing I had merely survived an unpleasant encounter with a vain man. I was tragically unaware that by refusing to pay the required toll for success in his world, I had signed my own professional and public death warrant. I was home asleep, exhausted and emotionally drained, when he executed the first, most critical phase of my professional assassination. The next morning, my original canvas, The Scar of Progress, had vanished without a trace from the locked, secure studio, where the finalists' pieces were stored under guard. The irony was devastating. The very progress I had painted about had immediately scarred me, leaving me suddenly empty-handed. I frantically reported the theft to every authority I could find. But Hollis moved with a devastating institutional precision that my naive 18-year-old self couldn't possibly comprehend. He had already placed timely, confidential phone calls to the dean and key faculty members, carefully whispering that I was emotionally unstable, prone to fabricating wild, self-aggrandizing accusations, and merely seeking attention. My legitimate panic over the stolen work was instantly reframed by the authorities as hysteria and instability, when the campus security finally conducted a perfunctory search of the studio. A search deliberately delayed until hours after Hollis conveniently alerted them. They predictably found nothing. My original masterpiece was definitively gone, and my integrity was instantly compromised, smeared with suspicion within the small, poisonous art community. I was not only disqualified from the prestigious competition, but formally investigated by a cynical committee for disrupting the integrity of the thesis process by fabricating a theft. No one, especially not the powerful men on the board who owed Hollis favors or feared his disapproval, dared to question his polished version of the events. The public humiliation was total and absolute, a psychological tactic designed specifically to crush the spirit and ensure silence. Within a week, despite my excellent academic record, I was quietly expelled from the academy, my promising name forever tarnished with the invisible, career-ending stain of discredited talent and emotional instability. My raw, young ambition, which had been so close to fruition, was surgically cut out of me, and my entire future was stolen by the very man I had once admired. I left Harrington Academy with nothing but a packed suitcase, a handful of worthless preparatory sketches, and a profound, festering wound that would never fully heal, but instead would harden into diamond-like resolve. 2 years later, Arthur Hollis, buoyed by the silence surrounding my expulsion, unveiled his new direction to great critical fanfare and commercial success. His central, career-defining piece, the one that critics hailed as his artistic maturation, was a massive, sprawling canvas titled The Progress Scar. It was, in every technical detail, perspective, and emotional arc, a faithful, utterly plagiarized copy of my stolen work, only rendered with his signature brushstrokes and his established stylistic authority to make it seem like his own invention. The theft wasn't just of paint and vision. It was the audacious public claim over my entire intellectual property and unique voice, executed with impunity. The entire international art world celebrated his profound breakthrough into a new stylistic period, completely unaware they were praising and funding a crime committed against a destitute and marginalized young woman. The white-hot rage and sense of violation I felt at seeing my soul displayed and championed under his deceitful name should have destroyed me, driven me mad with bitterness, or forced me into perpetual obscurity, as he intended. Instead, that rage became the bedrock of my entire existence. It forged me, rather than shattered me, into something cold, focused, and utterly unbreakable. I realized that attacking Hollis directly, immediately or emotionally would be utterly futile. He owned the narrative, and I was merely a forgotten outcast whose words carried no weight. My revenge, I decided that day, would not be loud, brief, or messy. It would not be an emotional outburst. It would be a slow, elaborate, and time-consuming institutional construction, perfectly engineered over decades to destroy not just the man's reputation, but the very foundation of his carefully built, fraudulent legacy. It would be a process of slow, public, scholarly, and undeniable sabotage. I changed my path completely, burying my painting ambitions forever. I entered the administrative backrooms of the art world, pursuing curatorial studies and museum administration. I devoured history, learned financing, mastered the arcane science of provenance documentation, and most importantly, cultivated the precise, measured, and utterly emotionless demeanor of a professional who never makes a mistake. My goal became simple and singular: rise to a position of such undeniable global authority that when I finally spoke the truth, the world would have no choice but to accept it as gospel. Every promotion I earned, every lauded exhibition I created, every highly praised acquisition I made for major institutions was merely a tool, a new level of clearance, a higher credential that brought me closer to the essential, guarded materials I needed to execute my plan. I intentionally built a decades-long reputation as the foremost scholarly authority on Hollis, culminating in writing the definitive, foundational monograph on his early work. I studied the enemy's canvas until I knew every flaw, every brushstroke, and every lie that lay beneath the surface, transforming myself from victim to vengeful scholar. My monograph on Arthur Hollis, published 20 years after my expulsion, was a calculated performance of scholarly admiration, a required step in establishing irreversible authority. It was universally lauded for its exhaustive detail, its meticulous footnoting, and its absolute lack of apparent bias toward the subject, solidifying my position as his ultimate, objective, and trusted interpreter. Within that immense, dense volume, however, lay the first subtle structural layer of my planned destruction, meticulously footnoted references to highly obscure regional artists from the 1970s, detailed technical inconsistencies I noted in Hollis's early periods, and scholarly questions raised about the chain of custody for unverified materials sourced from his loft studio during that critical time. These academic breadcrumbs were invisible to the casual reader, interpreted only by specialists as dry, historical analysis, but they were codes for the few specialists, and crucially for myself, that something foundational was unstable in his chronological development. The book, seemingly a tribute, was in fact a highly sophisticated Trojan horse, delivered directly into the heart of the art world with an elegant, prestigious bow. Over the next decade, leveraging my immense institutional influence and discretionary acquisition budget, I strategically acquired 3 specific, seemingly unremarkable paintings. These were not Hollis pieces, which would have raised suspicion. They were minor, obscure works by my female contemporaries from the Harrington Academy class of 1974, all known, based on my secret archival research, for using a very rare experimental brand of cadmium yellow pigment that carried a unique trace element signature, detectable only by advanced mass spectrometry. I secured these under the guise of completing the regional narrative of the period, arguing for their minor historical significance. In reality, these paintings served as my 3 crucial, scientifically validated control samples. They were the key to unlocking the forensic proof I needed, waiting patiently in the museum's secure, climate-controlled vaults, until the exact moment for the necessary molecular analysis finally arrived, hidden in plain sight as part of the permanent collection. The next critical, physical piece of my plan was securing Hollis's vast private estate and archive. When the great man finally died 15 years ago, at the height of his public fame, ironically, his family, trusting my long-demonstrated devotion, donated his entire private archive to the very institution where I now served as the all-powerful Chief Curator. This act was their final arrogant expression of trust in my supposed unwavering dedication to his legacy. The archive contained thousands of letters, decades of detailed financial records, and most importantly for my purposes, the meticulous, handwritten studio inventory and supply purchase logs from the tumultuous 1970s. This was the raw, physical data I had been waiting 4 decades to process, verify, and ultimately weaponize. I personally spent 2 full years cataloging the immense Hollis archive, insisting on working in absolute isolation behind reinforced, locked doors in the museum's lowest sub-basement. I dismissed all junior assistants, claiming the extreme sensitivity of the biographical material required my personal, discreet attention. In reality, I was meticulously searching for the single physical record of his crime against me. I finally found it. A single, folded page in his otherwise meticulously organized 1974 financial ledger, inconspicuously marked supplies and expenses. It noted the spontaneous, large-sum purchase of a new, exceptionally large canvas and detailed the considerable cost of shipping via private, expedited courier service the day after my thesis piece mysteriously disappeared. The shipping address was an anonymous, post-box warehouse in another, distant state, far from the city. This seemingly mundane, easily overlooked receipt, buried in a financial ledger, was my true smoking gun. It was physical evidence of the clandestine, immediate transportation of a massive, uncatalogued object, precisely following the reported theft of my work. However, a single financial receipt wouldn't immediately sway the deeply entrenched art world. I needed an unimpeachable academic accomplice, a living, respected witness who could scientifically authenticate my findings without any personal stake. I searched the globe for years and located Dr. Alistair Finch, a highly respected, fiercely independent art historian, known globally for his groundbreaking work in advanced pigment analysis and forensic dating of canvases. He was famous for his absolute scientific integrity and his total lack of institutional affiliation, making him the perfect, unbiased conduit for the truth. I approached Dr. Finch not with a request for personal vengeance, but with a complex, compelling, scholarly enigma that I knew would engage his formidable intellect. I asked him to forensically analyze 3 specific canvases by Hollis, including his most famous and valuable piece, the progress scar, alongside my 3 carefully selected control samples, requesting only a completely blind objective report on their exact pigment composition, age, and binding agents. I created a convincing cover story, claiming I suspected A wide-ranging, sophisticated forgery ring had been operating during that decade, targeting all regional artists equally, and I needed hard proof. Attracted by the sheer scientific complexity of the mystery, Dr. Finch agreed instantly, requesting only access to the samples and complete freedom to publish his findings independently. The highly technical test results came back 6 months later, delivered on sterile official university letterhead, signed and stamped by Dr. Finch himself. The report confirmed that the unique cadmium yellow trace element signature, the one I had isolated in my 3 control samples, was also present at the molecular level, in a deep layer of Hollis's The Progress scar. Dr. Finch stated unequivocally that this specific experimental element combination was not available commercially to Hollis in his area at the time he claimed to have painted the work. The scientific analysis proved, beyond any shadow of academic or legal doubt, that the canvas itself had been manipulated, possibly painted over a prior work, or, most critically, that the primary materials belonged to someone else entirely. The forensic report was the physical, undeniable engine of my vengeance, providing the scientific fact I needed to dismantle Hollis's creative claims. But physical evidence often remains too abstract. I still needed the profound, crushing emotional anchor to make the lie utterly repulsive to the public. I found it in a dusty box of personal letters from Hollis's early social circle. They were a series of casual, crass, drunken postcards sent between Hollis and a former classmate in late 1975. They never mentioned my name, but one postcard casually referenced an amusing little problem with the art student who wouldn't cooperate and closed with the chillingly dismissive line, "She should have just been grateful for the attention. But now her genius belongs entirely to Arthur." This single, casual, and utterly arrogant admission of guilt, written in the mentor's own hand, years after the fact, confirmed the deliberate malice and profound cruelty of his actions, not just the mere technical theft of a canvas. It proved his intent was to crush a young spirit and appropriate its power. This postcard would be the voice of the victim, confirming the forensic data. I knew the final exhibition had to be the setting for the climax. It required the immense scale and the institutional gravity of a national museum to ensure maximum, irrevocable, and unchallengeable impact. A small gallery reveal would have simply been dismissed as a petty, unsubstantiated vendetta from a disgraced figure. I secured the prestigious Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall for the Hollis retrospective, strategically using every ounce of political capital and every professional favor I had, painstakingly, accumulated over 50 years of unwavering professional conduct. The museum saw a guaranteed blockbuster exhibit that would draw unprecedented crowds and prestige. I saw the ideal, controlled stage for a public, high society execution. The logistical effort was immense, requiring years of negotiation and the silencing of many internal doubts, but every bureaucratic hurdle I cleared was another essential shackle I was placing on Hollis's memory. The date was now set, the RSVPs from the global elite were tallied, and the entire world was finally primed for Eliza Vance's final, definitive masterpiece of curation. The exhibit was structured with deliberate, agonizing chronology, meticulously guiding the audience through Hollis's early, technically proficient but utterly forgettable works, up to the explosive breakthrough period of 1976, the period inaugurated by the stolen canvas, The Progress scar. I placed The Progress scar in the climactic dead-center gallery, giving it a prominent, solitary pedestal, bathed in a precise, dramatic spotlight that made it glow with false significance. Visitors would spend 45 minutes walking toward this monumental lie, absorbing the false narrative of Hollis's genius that I myself had carefully and dutifully constructed for the museum. The immense emotional weight I layered onto this painting over 5 decades ensured that the audience would view it as the ultimate expression of his creativity, making the subsequent, final, and crushing reveal all the more devastatingly effective. The final gallery, however, was where I concentrated the cold, hard truth, the ultimate destination of my meticulously planned revenge. This room, deceptively labeled Influences and Origins on the museum guide, was supposed to display innocuous sketches and preliminary authorized studies. Instead, I had secretly designed a 3-part installation that served as a judicial tribunal. The first wall contained the entire forensic report from Dr. Finch, blown up to enormous, readable scale, and displayed alongside highly magnified cross-sections of the analyzed paint samples, clearly annotating the presence of the unique cadmium yellow in Hollis's piece and my control samples. The science was unimpeachable, cold, and utterly neutral, leaving absolutely no room for scholarly or casual debate. The second wall contained the enlarged, laminated copies of Hollis's 1974 shipping receipt and the 1975 postcard, clearly displaying his signature and confirming the timeline of the secret transportation and the cruel intent. Beneath these damning documents, I installed a small monitor continuously running a loop of my 1974 Academy expulsion documents, showing the official charges of instability that he had orchestrated. This wall was dedicated to the crime and the perpetrator's intent, providing the human context for the Grand Hall was a shimmering ocean of black ties and haute couture, a symphony of expensive whispers and clinking champagne flutes. I stood near the entrance, a small, elegant figure in a deep sapphire gown, receiving congratulations with quiet grace. I saw Mrs. Evelyn Hollis, Arthur's 80-year-old widow, a woman whose entire identity was built on his stolen fame, gliding past me with a faint, patronizing smile, entirely oblivious to the sword hanging above her inherited life. I watched the assembled crowd absorb the first 3 galleries, the unremarkable beginnings, the critical successes, and then the gallery leading directly to the colossal lie, the progress scar. The atmosphere was thick with cultural reverence, a perfume I knew I was about to transform into the bitter scent of scandal and irreparable ruin. The crowd surged forward toward the central room, drawn like a tide to the sheer scale of the infamous painting. I allowed myself a fleeting dark moment of triumph as I watched the faces of the most influential critics, men and women who had spent decades writing glowing treatises on the genius of this very piece, pausing in profound admiration. Their collective intellectual investment in the lie made my final blow all the more effective. The air conditioning hummed, the spotlights focused, and for the last few moments, Arthur Hollis was still a legend. I noted the time precisely, 8:47 p.m. I slipped away from the receiving line, making my own quiet, decisive journey toward the final gallery, the Chamber of Truth, when the elite cohort, the Hollis family, the museum board, and the lead critics, finally reached the corridor leading to the final Influences room. I was already waiting, standing perfectly still. The subtle shift in mood began as they entered the antechamber. Instead of the warm, inviting light of the previous rooms, this space was starkly illuminated by cold, institutional white light, the kind of light used in a courtroom or a forensics lab. The first sounds were murmurs of confusion, then outright disapproval. A prominent critic sniffed technical data. "Really, Eliza? What an odd choice for a finale." I simply offered a small, knowing smile and gestured toward the first installation wall, the gigantic blow-up of Dr. Finch's scientific report, pristine and damning. The confusion deepened as they began to read. They saw the molecular diagrams, the pigment cross-sections, and the stark highlighted comparison tables detailing the presence of the unique cadmium yellow in the progress scar and the unrelated control paintings from 1974. These were not subjective artistic opinions. These were cold, scientific facts presented with institutional authority. Mrs. Hollis, initially dismissive, squinted at the wall, her aristocratic composure starting to crack as she realized the dense text wasn't about aesthetics, but about provenance, the legal history of ownership. Her son, a hedge fund manager who only understood value, quickly pulled out his phone, attempting to search for the complex terminology, The science was working precisely as intended, serving as an insurmountable wall of unassailable fact. The transition to the second wall sealed the narrative. Here, the blow-ups of Hollis's own 1974 shipping receipt and the cruel 1975 postcard, with his characteristic cursive scrawled across it, were displayed under glass. The text, amusing little problem with the art student who wouldn't cooperate, was circled in bold red marker. The juxtaposition of the technical data from the first wall with the human malice of the second was devastatingly effective. It transformed the issue from a scholarly dispute into a clear, despicable act of theft and character assassination. The gasps started then, sharp and breathy, as the guests realized this wasn't an exhibit, it was an indictment of the century's most celebrated artist. I watched Mrs. Hollis. Her face, usually powdered and placid, went a ghastly ash white. She swayed slightly, her hand gripping the silk sleeve of her son, who was now frantically reading the fine print of the old expulsion document displayed below the postcard. The silence in the grand hall, moments ago filled with cultured chatter, had been replaced by a dense, agonizing vacuum. The security team I had prearranged subtly moved to positions near the entrance, not to keep people in, but to maintain order, a visible sign that this was a serious, prepared event, not a spontaneous outburst of madness. The trap had sprung, and the most powerful people in the room were caught in its meticulous mechanism. The final, crushing blow came from the third wall. The guests turned, expecting a complex synthesis of evidence, but found only the single, dramatically lit, empty easel. It stood there, a silent, powerful monument to the 70 years of creative output that had been brutally murdered by Hollis's ambition. The impact of the emptiness was immense, far greater than any physical painting could have achieved. The emptiness spoke of lost years, stolen identity, and the void left behind by a life that had been forced to become a lie. It was the visual representation of my missing soul. Above that vacant canvas, the elegant plaque declared the truth with horrifying finality. The Scar of Progress, 1974. Creator, Eliza Vance. Status, stolen by Arthur Hollis. I stepped forward, placing my hand gently on the polished wood of the empty easel. My voice, quiet but amplified by the sudden, absolute silence, cut through the tension. "Tonight," I stated, looking directly at the horrified face of Mrs. Hollis. "This is not an exhibit on Arthur Hollis. It is an exhibit on the cost of Arthur Hollis. He didn't just steal a painting, he stole the identity of the artist, and tonight, I am reclaiming it." I ignored the director and turned to the journalists, who were now pushing past security, recognizing the magnitude of the story. I offered them the full indexed case file, a binder detailing the timeline, the evidence, and the legal analysis of the theft, all prepared months in advance. "You have your story," I told them, my voice firm and clear, finally shedding the polite fragility of the curator. "You have the facts. The verdict is no longer mine to give. It is history's." The press-feeding frenzy began immediately, ensuring the story would be printed on every front page worldwide by dawn. I had anticipated the museum's immediate legal response. Within the hour, the director, now backed by a frantic legal team, issued a statement calling the final gallery a regrettable, unauthorized, and personal attack, and announced my immediate termination. However, my termination was merely procedural. I had resigned 2 days prior, effective at 9 p.m. on the night of the opening, ensuring the museum couldn't claim the exhibit was the unauthorized act of an employee, but the deliberate, calculated statement of the institution's former chief curator. As the police and private security arrived to manage the escalating media circus, I simply walked out. No one tried to stop me. The guards were too busy managing the chaos I had unleashed. I paused at the massive front doors, looking back at the grand hall, knowing that Hollis's entire, fraudulently constructed legacy was now imploding behind those ornate walls. It was a beautiful, devastating catastrophe, 50 years in the making. My debt had been paid in full, with interest compounded daily by silence. I stepped onto the street, the cool night air washing over me, leaving the shouting and the flashing cameras behind. A private town car, arranged weeks ago, was waiting. The driver, a stranger, opened the door, and I sank into the plush leather seat. I felt an exhaustion, deeper than any fatigue I had ever known, but also a profound crystalline clarity. The weight of the lie, the decades of meticulous, hidden effort, had finally been lifted. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to finally, truly visualize the painting I had created as a young woman. The scar of progress. It was perfect, raw, and vibrant, still existing in my mind exactly as it had on the day Hollis stole it. It was the only masterpiece that truly mattered. I realized then that my revenge was not the destruction of Hollis, but the reclamation of my own truth, which was now irrevocably etched into history. The car pulled away from the museum and drove toward the quiet streets of my own neighborhood. I reached into my purse and pulled out the old, folded, creased 1970 Academy application, the one with the section for preferred artist name. With a steady hand, I crossed out the name I had used for 70 years and wrote my new name, the name I had earned, Eliza Vance. The victory was not in the chaos, but in the final, quiet certainty of my own identity. The morning light filtering through my apartment window felt different. It was heavy with consequence, yet blindingly clear. I didn't need to check the news. I could feel the seismic shockwave moving through the cultural landscape. The Hollis name, once synonymous with artistic genius and old money integrity, was now universally tainted by fraud and abuse. The family's wealth, tied intrinsically to the market value of his work, was already in freefall, the pieces suddenly toxic and worthless to serious collectors. Mrs. Hollis's carefully preserved dignity, the foundation of her entire social existence, had been publicly stripped away. This was not just professional ruin. It was the total erasure of a fabricated historical narrative, a deep, lasting structural collapse that no public relations team could ever repair. I felt no remorse, only the profound, cold satisfaction of a debt finally settled at the institutional level. The museum director, after his initial shock and fury, quickly realized the futility of fighting the evidence. Dr. Finch's forensic report was already circulating among every major art institution globally, peer-reviewed and scientifically sound, making the museum's immediate defense crumble. The scandal would haunt the Metropolitan for a decade, but the board, seeking to salvage some integrity, would eventually be forced to publicly acknowledge the facts of my exhibit, even while condemning my methods. They would hold hearings, launch investigations, and slowly, institutionally, the truth would solidify into historical consensus. My termination was irrelevant. My legacy was sealed, not as a curator of others' work, but as the author of the most important fact-driven exposure in art history. I had already put my physical affairs in order. The small cottage I owned on the coast of Maine, purchased decades ago as my true sanctuary, was ready. I transferred all my liquid assets, modest but sufficient, into a secure trust. I had no children, no family remaining to complicate the aftermath, just a solitary life that was finally, truly my own. I looked at the few preparatory sketches of the scar of progress I had saved from 1974, yellowed and fragile. They were no longer symbols of loss, but blueprints of a profound delayed triumph. I packaged them carefully, knowing they would travel with me to Maine as relics of a war I had finally won. That afternoon the phone rang, the number blocked. I answered it, expecting a hysterical plea from a trustee or a threat from a Hollis lawyer. It was Dr. Finch. He didn't offer congratulations or condolences. He offered professional respect. He told me he had spent the morning rerunning the data, searching for any possible flaw in his analysis, and finding none. He said simply, "Eliza, I understand now. I saw the postcard. It was a terrible risk you took, but the science is irrefutable. You have done a great service to history, and a greater one to yourself. I hope you find peace." His measured scientific validation was perhaps the most meaningful form of approval I could receive, confirming that my act was one of truth, not merely vengeance. The ultimate irony, I realized, was that Hollis's legacy would endure, but only as a footnote in the story of Eliza Vance. Every textbook, every documentary that mentioned his name, would now be forced to reference the Vance-Finch scandal of 2024, cementing his identity as a thief. My own name, once erased, would become synonymous not only with curatorial excellence, but with a profound, almost mythical patience and an unflinching dedication to truth. The curator, often the silent background figure, had finally stepped into the blinding foreground, claiming authorship over the entire historical correction. My final act as a resident of the city was to send an unsigned letter to the National Archives. Inside was a complete copy of the evidence file, sealed and marked to be opened in 50 years. I did this not for future vindication. That was already secure, but to ensure that even if the Met tried to whitewash the scandal over time, the definitive truth would resurface for a future generation of scholars, long after I and everyone involved were gone. It was an insurance policy against the insidious tendency of history to forget a greater one to yourself. I hope you find peace. His measured scientific validation was perhaps the most meaningful form of approval I could receive, confirming that my act was one of truth, not merely vengeance. The ultimate irony, I realized, was that Hollis's legacy would endure, but only as a footnote in the story of Eliza Vance. Every textbook, every documentary that mentioned his name, would now be forced to reference the Vance-Finch scandal of 2024, cementing his identity as a thief. My own name, once erased, would become synonymous not only with curatorial excellence, but with a profound, almost mythical patience, and the elegant old woman, the masterful curator, had dissolved into the cool, relentless quiet of the Maine coast. Standing before the immense, indifferent ocean, Eliza finally allowed the 50-year-long siege on her heart to end. The mental noise, the meticulous planning, the suppressed rage, the constant, anxious tick of the revenge countdown was replaced by the eternal, rhythmic surge of the tide. The city life, which had housed the carefully constructed scaffolding of her vengeance, receded into irrelevance, leaving behind a woman who felt, for the first time since her youth, simply Eliza. She realized the true mastery was not the collapse of Arthur Hollis's fraudulent pillar, but the survival of her own creative spirit. She retrieved her old sketches of the scar of progress, now no longer viewing them as relics of a crime, but as blueprints of the profound delayed triumph that had finally corrected history. Settling into her coastal sanctuary, Eliza's final quiet rebellion began. Not against Hollis, but against the darkness that had defined her. Her hands, once guiding provenance documents, now found solace in soil and simple woodworking, reconnecting her to the honest physicality of the world. She picked up a pencil and began to sketch something new, the light on the waves, the unyielding granite cliffs, a slow, tentative process of rebirth, utterly free from external validation or institutional demands. She turned off the reports and the noise of the world, understanding that the justice was delivered, the debt was paid, and the final victory lay not in the chaos she had unleashed, but in the profound, crystalline certainty of her own reclaimed identity. She was, finally, the artist ready to paint her actual, honest masterpiece.